The people who frighten you the most are rarely the ones who knock on your door, they're the ones who already know your name. Claire Dawson had spent the last 11 months convincing herself that silence could be a safe place. Her small craftsman-style house on the quiet edge of Westchester County was far enough from Manhattan to let the night sound ordinary again. Wind brushed through maple trees, a neighbor's porch light flickered across damp pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train rolled north like a low heartbeat fading into darkness. It was almost 10:30 on a chilly October evening when she locked the front door, set her worn leather satchel on the kitchen counter, and finally let herself breathe. The tea kettle began to whistle softly while rain tapped against the windows with patient persistence. Everything about the evening felt predictable, almost comforting, until the headlights arrived. They swept across her living room wall in slow, deliberate arcs before stopping directly outside her house. Claire froze. The kettle continued to sing behind her, filling the silence she no longer trusted. She stepped toward the curtain without touching it, careful to stay hidden behind the wall. A black SUV rested beneath the street lamp. Its polished surface reflected streaks of rain like liquid silver. Another vehicle pulled in behind it, then another. None of them moved, no one hurried. Whoever had come expected time to belong to them. Her heartbeat quickened. She hadn't worked child protection cases in nearly a year, yet old instincts never disappeared. They simply waited. She quietly switched off the kitchen light. Darkness settled around her. Outside, one rear passenger door opened. A tall man stepped onto the wet pavement beneath a black umbrella held by someone else. Even from across the yard, there was something unsettling about how naturally the others adjusted around him. No loud commands, no dramatic gestures, just silent coordination born from long habit. Claire recognized that kind of authority immediately. She reached for her phone. Before her fingers touched it, someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. Calm, patient, almost respectful. The sound echoed through the house with terrifying confidence. Whoever stood outside knew she was home. The knock came again. Exactly 3 times, Claire remained perfectly still. Another 30 seconds passed before a deep voice carried through the rain. "Miss Dawson, I know you're inside." Her stomach tightened. She had never heard the voice before. "I'm not leaving until we talk." The words weren't threatening. Somehow that made them worse. She looked toward the back door, mentally measuring the distance to the fence beyond the yard. She could leave. She could disappear before anyone noticed. Then another voice interrupted her thoughts. Small, gentle, barely louder than the rain itself. "Daddy, can we go home now?" Claire slowly looked through the narrow opening in the curtain. A little girl sat inside the SUV, hugging a faded stuffed rabbit against her chest. She couldn't have been older than 8. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She simply looked exhausted, staring through rain-speckled glass at the front porch as though she had already waited too long. Claire frowned. Nothing about the scene matched the story her instincts had already written. She expected anger. She expected intimidation. She expected revenge. Child. The man removed his gloves before stepping closer to the porch. Rain collected on the shoulders of his charcoal overcoat, yet he ignored it completely. His face remained unreadable beneath the porch light. Strong features. Dark hair brushed neatly back, calm green eyes that seemed to notice every shadow without searching for them. Claire finally unlocked the deadbolt but kept the chain secured. She opened the door only a few inches. Cool autumn air drifted inside with the scent of rain-soaked cedar. "I don't know who you are," she said carefully. "Then allow me to introduce myself." His voice remained controlled, almost gentle. "My name is Sebastian Romano." The name landed harder than she expected. Even after leaving New York City, stories still traveled north. Powerful businessman, philanthropist, private investor. Rumors whispered far more dangerous titles whenever people thought microphones were turned off. Claire had learned long ago that rumors often grew around fear. She had also learned that fear usually started somewhere real. "If this is about one of my old cases," she said, "I don't discuss former investigations." Sebastian studied her quietly. He never glanced inside the house, never pushed against the door, never raised his voice. "I didn't come because of what you investigated," he replied. "I came because of who remembers you." Claire said nothing. Behind him, the little girl lifted her eyes toward the porch for the first time. Their gazes met for only a second before the child quickly looked away again, clutching the stuffed rabbit even tighter. Something about those eyes tugged at a memory Claire couldn't quite reach. A classroom, colored pencils, a frightened child who refused to speak. The memory disappeared before she could grasp it. "You're mistaken," Claire answered. "I think you have the wrong person." Sebastian slowly reached into his coat. Claire, instead of a weapon, he removed a folded piece of paper sealed inside a transparent evidence sleeve. He carefully placed it on the porch without stepping closer. "You can look after I leave," he said. "No one else has been able to help her." Claire didn't move. The rain grew heavier between them. "I think you came here for revenge," she admitted quietly. For the first time, something changed in Sebastian's expression. Not anger, not amusement, just a trace of sadness that vanished almost immediately. He looked back toward the SUV where the little girl waited silently beneath the dim interior light. When he spoke again, every word carried the weight of someone who had already run out of better choices. "If I wanted revenge," he said softly, "I never would have brought my daughter." Claire waited until the engines faded into the rain before she finally opened the front door completely. Cold air rushed inside, carrying the scent of wet leaves and fresh asphalt. The evidence sleeve remained exactly where Sebastian Romano had left it, untouched on the wooden porch, as though he believed she would eventually pick it up. She looked toward the empty street one last time. The convoy had disappeared without urgency, leaving behind only tire tracks shimmering beneath the streetlights. She bent down and carefully lifted the plastic sleeve. Inside was a single sheet of white paper. There were no threats, no legal documents, no photographs meant to intimidate her. Instead, there was a child's drawing. Crayon lines stretched unevenly across the page. A little girl stood between two tall trees beneath a bright yellow sun. Next to her was another figure with brown hair wearing a blue jacket. Above the drawing, written in careful block letters, were 6 simple words: "Thank you for staying with me." Claire stared at the page while memories she had buried months ago quietly surfaced. She remembered a temporary family services center outside Manhattan. She remembered an emergency placement after a frightening incident at school. She remembered sitting on a faded carpet surrounded by crayons because one terrified little girl refused to answer questions unless someone drew beside her first. Claire had spent nearly 3 hours sketching crooked trees and smiling birds until the child finally whispered a single word: safe. The case had been transferred within days. Confidential records had disappeared into another department, and Claire had never learned what happened afterward. She had assumed the little girl had found stability somewhere else. Now she realized she had been wrong. The kettle on the stove had long since cooled. Sleep never came. Before sunrise, Claire searched every memory she could still trust, but no official report ever mentioned the surname Romano. By 7 o'clock the following morning, the rain had stopped. Low clouds drifted above the Hudson River while pale autumn sunlight spilled across quiet neighborhoods waiting for another ordinary Tuesday. Claire drove south in her aging Subaru with the drawing resting carefully on the passenger seat. She had promised herself she would only ask questions, nothing more. The address Sebastian had quietly written on the back of the evidence sleeve led beyond stone walls, iron gates, and towering oak trees whose branches stretched across a winding private road. The estate looked less like a fortress than an old family property preserved through generations. Security cameras blended into the architecture so naturally they almost disappeared. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Children's chalk drawings decorated one section of the driveway near a basketball hoop. None of it matched the image she had built in her mind overnight. The front gate opened before she reached the call box. Someone had already been expecting her. Claire tightened her grip on the steering wheel. She almost turned around twice before reaching the main house. It stood overlooking a quiet lake where morning mist floated above still water. The building itself was elegant rather than extravagant, built from limestone that glowed softly beneath the rising sun. 2 security officers nodded politely as she stepped from her car. Neither searched her, neither touched her belongings. One simply opened the front door. Inside, silence filled the grand hallway. Family photographs lined the walls instead of expensive artwork. Some showed vacations near beaches. Others captured birthdays, school plays, and fishing trips. One frame had been turned face down. Claire noticed it immediately but kept walking. Sebastian appeared at the far end of the hallway wearing a navy sweater instead of the tailored overcoat from the previous night. Without the rain and shadows surrounding him, he somehow looked more tired than intimidating. Dark circles rested beneath steady green eyes that suggested several sleepless nights had become routine. "Thank you for coming," he said. Claire folded her arms. "I came for answers." He nodded once. "That is fair." Before either of them could continue, light footsteps echoed from upstairs. A small figure stopped halfway down the staircase. Emily Romano held the same faded stuffed rabbit against her chest. She looked at Claire for several long seconds without speaking. Her light brown hair fell loosely across one shoulder. There was uncertainty in her expression, but not fear. Claire offered the smallest smile she could manage. Emily slowly descended the remaining steps. Every security officer in the room instinctively stepped farther back, giving the child space. Sebastian did not move toward his daughter. He simply watched, allowing her to choose. Emily stopped less than 3 feet from Claire. She carefully reached into the pocket of her sweater and removed a folded blue crayon. She held it out with quiet determination. Claire recognized it instantly. During difficult interviews with frightened children, she always carried blue crayons because anxious children statistically chose calming colors first. She had forgotten that tiny habit years ago. Emily had not. Claire accepted the crayon without speaking. Emily's shoulders relaxed almost immediately. For the first time since entering the estate, Claire felt something shift inside the enormous house. The tension eased. The child looked toward her father, then back at Claire before softly slipping one small hand into Claire's open palm. Sebastian lowered his eyes for only a moment, as though hiding relief he could no longer afford to show. Claire looked from the little girl to the silent man across the hallway. Nothing about the morning answered the question she had carried through the gates. It only made that question larger. If Emily remembered her after all this time, why had someone worked so hard to erase every trace that they had ever met? The safest places were often the easiest to betray because everyone inside believed the danger had already been kept outside. Claire remained beside Emily while the little girl quietly traced circles across the polished hardwood floor with the tip of her blue crayon, never actually marking the wood, only pretending to draw invisible paths that seemed meaningful to her alone. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows overlooking the lake, filling the entrance hall with warm gold that softened every shadow. Yet Claire could not ignore the uneasy feeling settling beneath the calm. Beautiful places sometimes carried the heaviest secrets. Sebastian led her toward a bright sitting room overlooking the water instead of an office or conference room. There were bookshelves filled with children's novels, family board games stacked beneath a window seat, and fresh flowers arranged on a small table beside a piano. Nothing resembled the intimidating headquarters Claire had imagined on the drive south. Emily quietly wandered toward the window and sat cross-legged with her stuffed rabbit, while 2 housekeepers greeted her with genuine smiles before continuing their work. No one interrupted, no one hurried her. Sebastian poured coffee into 2 simple ceramic mugs before placing one within Claire's reach. "You still remember that I prefer tea," she observed before realizing the words had escaped too quickly. Sebastian gave the faintest nod. "I asked someone to prepare both. I did not want to assume." The answer sounded honest, almost careful. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug without drinking, then start with the truth. Sebastian looked toward the lake for several silent seconds before speaking. "Emily has not trusted a single therapist, tutor, security specialist, or caregiver in nearly a year. Every professional recommendation ended exactly the same way. She refused to speak, she refused to cooperate, she refused to leave her room." Claire glanced toward the little girl, who remained quietly watching ducks drift across the water. "But she came to me. She walked to you," Sebastian corrected gently. "That has never happened before." Claire looked back at him. "Why?" He slowly reached into a folder resting beside his chair and removed several photocopies. They were evaluations from child development experts, speech specialists, and behavioral consultants. Every page ended with nearly identical conclusions. Progress limited. Emotional withdrawal continues. Patient remains guarded. One report included a photograph of a drawing remarkably similar to the one left on Claire's porch. Claire studied the picture carefully before looking up again. "Someone removed my name." Sebastian remained silent. Entire sections had been blacked out or replaced. Dates remained, locations remained, individual names did not. "Who authorized these edits?" she asked quietly. "I did not." His answer came immediately. "I discovered them 3 weeks ago." Claire slowly lowered the papers. The room suddenly felt smaller despite the high ceiling and open windows. Someone with access to confidential records had deliberately erased her involvement. That was not an administrative mistake, that was a decision. Emily suddenly stood and wandered toward a shelf covered with family photographs. She carefully picked up one silver frame and carried it to Claire. It showed a younger Emily laughing on a beach beside Sebastian while building an uneven sandcastle. Both were barefoot, neither appeared guarded. Claire noticed another detail almost immediately. Someone had been cropped out of the original picture. The remaining composition looked unusually narrow. "Who was standing here?" Claire asked softly, pointing toward the missing space. Emily's smile disappeared. The little girl hugged the frame tightly before lowering her eyes. She did not answer. Sebastian quietly accepted the photograph from his daughter and placed it face down on the table without explanation. Claire watched the movement carefully. He was protecting something, but whether he was protecting Emily or protecting the truth remained impossible to tell. Before she could ask another question, a discreet chime echoed from somewhere deeper inside the house. Sebastian glanced toward the hallway. One of the security officers appeared moments later. "Sir, the school director confirmed tomorrow's schedule," the guard said. "Everything remains unchanged." Sebastian thanked him with a simple nod. The guard disappeared almost immediately. Claire frowned. "Tomorrow? Emily wants to return to school," Sebastian answered. "For one day." Claire looked toward the child in surprise. Emily slowly nodded. It was the first clear decision she had expressed since Claire arrived. "She has not attended regular classes in months," Sebastian continued. "Yesterday she refused again. This morning she packed her backpack before sunrise." Claire felt both hope and concern settle together. Children rarely change that dramatically overnight without a reason. She looked at Emily's backpack resting beside the staircase. One zipper remained slightly open. Inside, colorful notebooks sat neatly stacked beside the familiar blue crayon box. A folded piece of paper slipped halfway from the front pocket, as though someone had tucked it away in a hurry. Emily quickly noticed Claire looking toward it and gently closed the zipper without saying a word. The movement lasted only a second, but it was enough. Claire had spent years reading children whose voices disappeared long before their emotions did. Emily was not hiding from Claire. She was protecting something. Unfortunately for everyone inside the house, someone else already seemed to know exactly where Emily planned to be the following morning. Morning arrived wrapped in pale silver clouds, and the Romano estate awakened with the quiet precision of people who had learned to prepare for uncertainty long before sunrise. Claire stood beside the front entrance holding a travel mug of untouched tea while watching Emily tighten the straps of her small navy backpack. The little girl wore a simple school uniform beneath a light grey jacket, and for the first time since Claire had arrived, there was a trace of excitement hidden beneath her cautious expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, but Claire noticed it in the way Emily checked twice to make sure her blue crayon box was safely inside the front pocket. Children rarely revealed hope with words. They carried it in habits. Sebastian walked down the front steps a few moments later, speaking quietly with the head of security before approaching his daughter. He crouched just enough to straighten the collar of her jacket without saying anything. Emily accepted the gesture, but kept her attention on Claire instead. The silent exchange lasted only seconds before Sebastian stood again. "The school has been informed that today will remain private," he said. "Classes continue normally, no interviews, no photographs, no visitors." Claire nodded, but something continued bothering her. "Who knows she is returning?" Sebastian answered without hesitation. "Only the principal, her teacher, my security team, and a very small administrative staff." Claire looked toward the waiting vehicles parked beneath the oak trees. "That is already more people than I would like." Sebastian met her eyes for a brief moment. "I agree." The drive to the private elementary school took just under 30 minutes through quiet suburban roads lined with brilliant autumn leaves. Golden maples and crimson oaks reflected across small lakes while children waited at neighborhood bus stops carrying oversized backpacks almost as large as they were. Emily spent most of the drive looking out the window with her stuffed rabbit resting quietly beside her. Every few miles she glanced toward Claire, almost as if confirming she had not disappeared. Claire answered each glance with the same reassuring smile. Trust was never built through speeches. It was built through consistency. When the convoy reached the school, Sebastian remained inside the lead vehicle. He had chosen not to step onto campus. Claire immediately understood why. A father with his reputation attracted attention even when he tried not to. Instead, she walked beside Emily across a brick pathway leading toward the front entrance, while two security officers remained far enough behind to avoid alarming the students. The school itself looked welcoming rather than exclusive. Bright murals decorated the hallways, paper pumpkins hung from classroom doors. Children's laughter drifted across the playground where recess had just begun. For a brief moment, everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Emily paused beside a bulletin board covered with colorful self-portraits completed by second graders. She carefully searched every drawing until she found the empty space where her own artwork had once been displayed. Her shoulders lowered slightly. Claire noticed immediately. "We can make another one," she said softly. Emily looked up and offered the smallest nod. It was not a smile, but it was closer than before. Their classroom teacher greeted them warmly, careful not to overwhelm Emily with too many questions. The other children welcomed her back with innocent curiosity before quickly returning to spelling games and math worksheets. Claire remained near the back of the classroom, quietly observing rather than interfering. Everything appeared calm, everything appeared safe. Unfortunately, appearances had begun to lose their meaning. Less than a mile away, someone sitting inside a parked sedan lowered a pair of binoculars after watching the Romano convoy enter the school grounds. A phone screen illuminated inside the quiet vehicle. One short message appeared before being erased almost immediately. "She is here." Back inside the classroom, Claire felt a familiar uneasiness she could not fully explain. She slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the front parking lot. Parents came and went. Delivery trucks unloaded cafeteria supplies. Teachers crossed sidewalks carrying stacks of papers. Nothing looked unusual, yet years of interviewing frightened children had taught her that instincts often noticed danger before evidence existed. During art period, Emily quietly opened her backpack and removed the blue crayon box. As Claire watched from across the room, a folded sheet of paper slipped from the front pocket and drifted gently onto the classroom floor. Emily reached for it quickly, but Claire arrived first. "May I?" she asked. Emily hesitated before giving a reluctant nod. Claire unfolded the paper carefully. It was another drawing, the same two figures standing beneath tall trees, the same yellow sun. But this time a third figure stood far away near the edge of the page. It had no face, only dark grey shading. Claire looked up at Emily, who immediately lowered her eyes. Before either of them could speak, the classroom intercom chimed softly. "Mrs. Henderson," the office secretary announced, "could you please send Emily Romano to the front office? Someone is here for an authorized early pickup." Claire's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Calm had always helped her think more clearly. She looked toward the teacher, who appeared genuinely confused because no early dismissal had been scheduled. Then Claire looked back at the drawing, still resting in her hands. For the first time that morning, she realized the faceless figure had not been standing outside the picture. It had been waiting beside the school all along. Claire did not move when the announcement echoed through the classroom, because the hesitation she saw on Mrs. Henderson's face mattered more than the words themselves. Experienced teachers recognized routine. This interruption was not routine. Emily slowly turned toward Claire instead of the classroom door, and her fingers tightened around the blue crayon until the paper wrapper began to wrinkle. That single gesture answered a question no report ever could. The little girl had heard similar requests before. Claire walked calmly toward the teacher and lowered her voice. "Did anyone notify you this morning about an early dismissal?" Mrs. Henderson glanced at her attendance folder before quietly shaking her head. "No. Parents usually send an email first, especially in Emily's situation." Claire nodded once. "Please call the office. Confirm who is waiting." The teacher reached for the classroom phone while keeping her expression relaxed enough that the children continued working without noticing the change in atmosphere. Claire remained beside Emily, gently placing the folded drawing back inside the backpack. "Everything is fine," she whispered. "Stay with me." Emily gave the smallest nod. Her breathing slowed almost immediately. 30 seconds later, the teacher lowered the receiver with visible confusion. "The office says no one requested an early pickup," she said quietly. "They never made that announcement." Before Claire could answer, the classroom intercom crackled again. A different voice apologized for a technical malfunction that had mistakenly activated the wrong room. The explanation sounded ordinary, too ordinary. Claire looked toward the hallway through the narrow window in the classroom door. Students continued walking between classes. Parents signed visitor forms at the front desk. Staff members smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet someone had known Emily was inside the building, and someone had chosen a method subtle enough to test the school's response without causing panic. That was not an accident. Claire excused herself and stepped into the hallway where one of Sebastian's security officers immediately approached from the opposite end. His expression remained composed, but the slight crease between his eyebrows suggested he had sensed the same problem. "We checked with the front office," he said quietly. "No visitor matching Emily's records ever signed in." Claire folded her arms. "What about phone calls?" "Nothing unusual." She looked toward the glass entrance doors where children chased one another across the playground under bright October sunshine. Everything appeared peaceful. That was exactly what unsettled her. Someone had learned the schedule. Someone had attempted to measure the school's procedures. It felt less like an attack than a rehearsal. Claire called Sebastian from the quiet hallway. He answered before the second ring. "Is she safe?" he asked immediately. "Yes," Claire replied. But someone tested the system. Silence lingered for several seconds. "Bring her home," Sebastian finally said, immediately. Claire expected him to sound angry. Instead, he sounded disappointed, as though one more invisible line had quietly confirmed what he already feared. 20 minutes later, the convoy left the school earlier than planned. Emily sat beside Claire in the back seat, drawing slowly inside a small sketchbook while autumn sunlight flashed through the windows with every passing tree. The little girl remained unusually focused on one page, adding careful details before closing the notebook the instant the estate gates came into view. Claire noticed but chose not to interrupt. Trust grew stronger when curiosity learned patience. Back at the house, Sebastian waited on the front terrace overlooking the lake. He listened without interrupting while Claire described the announcement, the phone verification, and the absence of any authorized visitor. When she finished, he looked toward the head of security, standing several feet away. "Review every communication sent to the school during the past 48 hours, he instructed calmly. "No assumptions, no shortcuts." The man nodded and disappeared without another word. Claire watched Sebastian carefully. "You already suspected someone had access to private information." He met her eyes. "I hoped I was wrong." Before either of them continued, Emily quietly walked onto the terrace carrying her sketchbook. She stopped beside Claire instead of her father and opened to the newest drawing. 3 figures stood beneath the familiar trees again. Claire recognized herself and Emily immediately. The third figure, which had once been only a grey silhouette, now wore a dark suit and stood closer than before. But another detail had changed. Hidden between the trees was a tiny bird-colored bright blue, almost invisible unless someone looked carefully. Emily gently tapped the bird with her finger before closing the sketchbook again. Claire smiled softly. "You want me to notice what everyone else overlooks?" Emily's eyes brightened for the briefest moment. It was the closest thing to a smile Claire had seen. Sebastian observed the quiet exchange from across the terrace without saying anything. He did not need to. For the first time since Claire had entered his world, his daughter had chosen to communicate through someone instead of hiding from everyone. It should have felt like progress. Instead, Claire found herself staring across the peaceful lake where a single maintenance truck slowly crossed the far shoreline before disappearing behind rows of towering pines. The vehicle belonged on the estate. The logo on its door certainly did not. The hardest truths rarely announce themselves with loud voices. More often they arrived disguised as ordinary details that everyone else walked past without a second glance. Claire could not stop thinking about the maintenance truck she had seen beyond the lake. The unfamiliar company logo had lingered in her memory long after it disappeared behind the pine trees. She had spent years teaching herself to trust quiet observations instead of dramatic assumptions, and that instinct had rarely failed her. Late that afternoon, soft amber light settled across the Romano estate, while a cool breeze carried the scent of cedar and the first fallen leaves of the season. Emily sat at a small table in the sunroom overlooking the water, carefully arranging colored pencils into perfect rows before beginning another drawing. Claire remained nearby with a notebook resting on her lap, pretending to read while quietly observing the little girl's rhythm. Children often revealed their fears through repetition before they ever found words. Sebastian entered carrying 2 mugs of tea instead of coffee. Without interrupting Emily, he placed one beside Claire and took the chair across from her. "You noticed the truck," he said. It was not a question. Claire nodded. "The logo did not match the landscaping company listed at your front gate." A faint expression of surprise crossed his face, disappearing again. Most people would never look that closely. Claire wrapped both hands around the warm mug. Most people were not trained to notice small inconsistencies. Sebastian glanced toward the windows where workers continued trimming hedges near the far shoreline. The crew was scheduled by estate management. "We are verifying every contractor now." Claire studied his calm expression. He never sounded defensive. He never dismissed her concerns simply because they were based on intuition instead of evidence. That alone separated him from many powerful men she had met throughout her career. Emily quietly stood and carried her newest drawing toward them. Instead of placing it on the table, she held it directly in front of Claire. 3 birds now flew above the familiar trees. 1 was blue, 2 were grey. The blue bird faced the house while the grey birds looked toward the woods beyond the lake. Claire smiled gently. The blue one is watching the house. Emily nodded. The grey ones are watching from outside. Another quiet nod. Sebastian leaned forward, studying the drawing with unusual attention. Has she ever drawn birds before? He asked. Claire looked at Emily before answering. Not that I have seen. Emily slowly pointed toward the lake outside the window. Claire followed the gesture. A flock of geese crossed the water before lifting into the evening sky, their reflections briefly stretching across the surface like moving shadows. She is trying to tell us someone is watching, Claire said softly. Sebastian remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he pressed a discreet button beneath the side table. Less than a minute later, the head of security entered the room. Increase observation around the eastern shoreline, Sebastian instructed calmly. Focus on contractor access and maintenance schedules, quietly. The man acknowledged the order and left without asking for an explanation. Claire noticed something else. Sebastian had never questioned Emily's instincts. He accepted them as seriously as any intelligence report. That realization quietly changed the way Claire saw him. Later that evening, after dinner, the estate settled into comfortable silence. Rain clouds gathered over the lake while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Emily wandered into the library carrying her stuffed rabbit and climbed into the oversized reading chair beside the fireplace. Claire selected a children's novel from the shelf and began reading aloud. She intentionally used different voices for each character, allowing the story to unfold at an easy pace. Halfway through the second chapter, Emily leaned gently against her shoulder. It happened so naturally that Claire almost missed it. Across the room, Sebastian paused in the doorway. He had apparently come looking for his daughter, but stopped the instant he saw her peacefully listening to the story. Firelight reflected softly across his face. There was relief there, but also something much quieter. Gratitude. He chose not to interrupt. Instead, he quietly turned off the brighter ceiling lights before leaving the room exactly as silently as he had entered. Claire watched him disappear down the hallway. Control no longer seemed like the quality that defined him most. Restraint did. Nearly an hour later, Emily had fallen asleep with the book still resting across her lap. Claire carefully carried the little girl upstairs, tucked the blanket around her shoulders, and placed the stuffed rabbit beside her pillow. As she gently switched off the bedside lamp, her eyes settled on a corkboard hanging above Emily's desk. School certificates, family photographs, birthday cards. Then one small note pinned beneath a drawing caught her attention. It was written in block letters with a blue crayon. If I forget, please find Claire. Claire felt the air leave her lungs. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, but the paper looked old, its edges softened by time, as though it had been hanging there for months. What Claire did not know was that, at that exact moment, someone inside the estate security office quietly deleted a single visitor log before shutting down the computer for the night. Some memories did not disappear because they were forgotten. They disappeared because someone made certain they could never be found again. Claire barely slept after discovering the note above Emily's desk. Long before sunrise, she stood beside the bedroom window watching a layer of morning mist drift slowly across the lake while the little girl continued sleeping peacefully beneath a quilt stitched with tiny blue stars. The words written in blue crayon repeated themselves over and over inside Claire's mind. If I forget, please find Claire. The sentence did not sound like the imagination of a frightened child. It sounded like instructions. Carefully, she photographed the note with her phone before placing it exactly where she had found it. She refused to disturb anything until she understood why it existed. Downstairs, the estate was unusually quiet. Fresh coffee filled the kitchen while soft jazz played through hidden ceiling speakers. Sebastian stood near the windows overlooking the gardens, reading several printed reports instead of using a tablet. He looked up the moment Claire entered. One glance at her face was enough. You found something, he said. Claire placed her phone on the table and turned the screen toward him. The photograph filled the display. Sebastian stared at the image for several long seconds without speaking. His steady expression finally cracked, not with panic but with genuine confusion. I have never seen that note before, he admitted quietly. Claire believed him. It was the first time she had watched surprise arrive before control. How long has that corkboard been in her room, she asked. He slowly lowered himself into a chair. I look at that room every day. Claire folded her arms. Then someone counted on the fact that people eventually stopped seeing what has always been there. Neither of them spoke again until Emily wandered into the kitchen, wearing soft pajamas and carrying her stuffed rabbit beneath one arm. She looked from Claire to her father before noticing the photograph still displayed on the phone. The little girl's eyes widened slightly. She walked over without hesitation and gently tapped the screen with one finger before placing her hand over her own heart. Claire crouched until they were at eye level. "Did you write this?" Emily nodded. "Do you remember when?" A brief pause followed. Emily looked toward the ceiling as though searching through distant memories before giving one slow shake of her head. Claire understood immediately. The child remembered writing it, but not why. She gently reached into her tote bag and removed several blank sheets of paper, along with the familiar blue crayon. Instead of asking direct questions, she placed the supplies on the kitchen table. Emily sat down almost automatically. For several quiet minutes she drew without interruption, while Claire and Sebastian remained completely silent. The first picture showed the familiar trees. The second showed the blue bird. Then Emily stopped, closed her eyes for a moment and drew something new. A small room with bright windows, shelves filled with toys, a colorful rug. Claire felt her heart beat slow. She recognized the room instantly. It was the interview and counseling room inside the County Child Advocacy Center where she had worked before leaving the agency. Emily added another detail. A woman wearing a blue jacket sat on the floor beside a little girl holding a rabbit. Then she carefully drew a calendar on the wall. Claire leaned closer. The tiny squares meant nothing until Emily circled one date with the blue crayon. Claire froze. That date matched the week Emily had briefly entered protective services before every record connected to Claire had mysteriously disappeared. "She remembers," Claire whispered. Sebastian looked from the drawing to Claire. "What does it mean?" Claire's voice remained soft. "It means we did meet exactly where I remembered. She was not imagining it, neither was I." Emily slowly turned another page and began drawing again. This time she sketched a filing cabinet with one drawer hanging open. Beside it she drew a single sheet of paper flying away in the wind. Claire felt an old memory surface with startling clarity. The day Emily's file had been transferred had also been the day the agency computer system unexpectedly crashed for several hours. At the time everyone blamed a technical failure. Now the coincidence no longer felt accidental. Less than a mile away, inside a modest office building that once housed the County Child Advocacy Center, an archived storage room remained locked behind rows of forgotten case files. One cabinet held an empty folder with Emily Romano's case number still printed neatly across the tab. The folder itself contained almost nothing. Unfortunately for the person who had removed its contents, one item had never been erased from the archive log. Claire did not know that records still existed. She only knew one undeniable truth. Emily had not remembered Claire by chance. Long before Sebastian arrived at her front door on that rainy night, a frightened little girl had already decided that if the day ever came when her own memories failed her, there was only one person she believed would come back and find her. The truth rarely arrived as one dramatic revelation. More often it emerged piece by piece until every quiet detail formed a picture too complete to ignore. By early afternoon, Claire sat inside the estate library surrounded by photocopies, handwritten notes, and children's drawings spread carefully across the long oak table. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting narrow beams across faded leather books and polished wood, while outside the lake reflected a sky that looked almost too peaceful to belong to the same story. Emily colored quietly on the rug a few feet away, occasionally glancing toward Claire before returning to another careful sketch. Sebastian entered carrying a slim folder that looked older than everything else on the table. "One of my attorneys found this in a private archive," he said. It was not inside Emily's official records. Claire accepted the folder and opened it carefully. Inside rested a single property access report dated almost 1 year earlier. Most of the page listed routine visitors to the Child Advocacy Center, where Emily had briefly stayed under protective supervision. Every signature appeared ordinary until Claire reached the final line. The visitor's name had been completely removed, but the employee authorization number remained visible. Claire stared at the number for several seconds before reaching into her notebook. During years of investigations, she had developed a habit of writing down employee codes whenever paperwork seemed incomplete. She flipped through several older pages until she found a faded reference list she had never thrown away. Her finger stopped on one entry. The authorization number belonged internal security administrator, not a social worker, not a therapist, and certainly not anyone responsible for child welfare. Sebastian leaned closer. What does that mean? Claire answered quietly. Someone outside the counseling staff accessed Emily's file before it disappeared. At that exact moment, Emily looked up from her drawing and gently slid another page across the rug toward Claire. This time the picture showed a large key beside an open door. Standing near the doorway was the same grey figure from earlier drawings, but now another person stood beside it, wearing a security badge coloured bright yellow. Claire looked from the drawing back to the authorization number. The connection felt impossible to ignore. She turned another page inside the archive folder and discovered a maintenance request submitted the very same afternoon Emily's records had been transferred. The request authorized temporary access to the secure filing room because of an electrical inspection. Claire frowned. No child interviews were scheduled during electrical maintenance. That entire hallway would have been closed. Sebastian slowly understood, meaning whoever entered had a legitimate excuse to be there. Claire nodded. Exactly. She looked toward the windows where estate employees moved naturally between the gardens, the garages, and the shoreline. Uniforms created trust, credentials created opportunity. Sometimes the easiest place to hide was inside a routine everyone accepted without question. Sebastian quietly called the head of security into the library. The man arrived within minutes carrying a digital tablet filled with contractor schedules, visitor logs, and estate personnel records. Claire noticed something almost immediately. One name appeared repeatedly across maintenance assignments during the past several months. Daniel Mercer, electrical systems, security upgrades, camera inspections. Does he work directly for you? Claire asked. The security chief shook his head. Independent contractor, highly recommended, background checked twice. Claire studied the schedule. Daniel Mercer had also supervised the shoreline cameras on the same day the unfamiliar maintenance truck appeared across the lake. Where is he today? She asked. The security chief glanced at the schedule. He requested personal leave this morning. Sebastian's expression remained calm, but the silence that followed carried unmistakable weight. Claire looked toward Emily, who had quietly returned to colouring. The little girl suddenly picked up her blue crayon and circled the yellow security badge she had drawn only moments earlier. Then she looked directly at Claire and slowly nodded once. It was not recognition of a face, it was recognition of a feeling. Children often remembered emotions long before they remembered names. Sebastian dismissed everyone except Claire before walking to the window overlooking the eastern shoreline. I trusted recommendations, he admitted softly. I believed every system could be strengthened if enough professionals examined it. Claire joined him beside the glass. Systems do not fail because they are weak. They fail because someone inside already understands how they work. Neither of them noticed Emily quietly placing her newest drawings at Claire's notebook as they continued talking. It was not until several minutes later, after the little girl had wandered into the garden with her stuffed rabbit, that Claire discovered the folded page tucked between her notes. She opened it slowly. The drawing showed the familiar blue bird perched on top of a security camera facing the lake. Beneath the picture, Emily had carefully written 3 simple words in uneven block letters. He watches first. Claire felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sunlight filling the room. Somewhere beyond the peaceful gardens, someone had been observing the Romano family long before they ever realized they were being watched. Sometimes the safest way to discover who was watching was to let them believe they were still invisible. By the following morning, the Romano estate looked almost unchanged. Gardeners trimmed hedges beneath bright autumn skies. Delivery trucks arrived through the front gate with ordinary supplies. Staff members moved through familiar routines that appeared untouched by suspicion. Only a handful of people knew that every camera facing the eastern shoreline had quietly begun recording through an isolated backup system that bypassed the estate's main security network. Claire stood on the second-floor balcony outside Emily's bedroom, watching sunlight ripple across the lake while cool wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere beyond the trees, someone believed they still understood every movement inside the property. That assumption had become their greatest weakness. Sebastian joined her carrying 2 folders instead of breakfast. The original security logs are still being monitored, he said quietly. Nothing unusual has appeared. Claire accepted 1 folder without taking her eyes off the shoreline. That is exactly what I expected. He looked at her with quiet curiosity. If someone has been manipulating records, they will continue using the system they trust. They do not know we stopped trusting it. A faint smile crossed Sebastian's face before disappearing beneath his usual calm expression. You think like an investigator. Claire finally looked at him. Old habits survive longer than careers. Downstairs, Emily sat in the breakfast room building tiny paper birds from blue construction paper. Every finished bird was carefully lined across the windowsill facing the gardens. Claire noticed something unusual. Emily intentionally left one empty space between every bird, creating a repeating pattern instead of placing them randomly. She is counting, Claire whispered. Sebastian followed her gaze. She has done that for months. Claire watched a little longer before quietly asking Emily, "Can you show me why you leave the spaces?" Emily reached for another paper bird but did not place it at the end of the row. Instead, she gently positioned it in the middle, filling one of the empty gaps. Then she looked toward the front driveway. Claire understood almost immediately. "Someone comes between safe places," she murmured. Emily nodded. It was another clue expressed through instinct rather than language. Mid-morning brought an unexpected opportunity. One of the assistant estate managers informed Sebastian that a scheduled inspection company had arrived to service the irrigation system along the eastern shoreline. Claire immediately exchanged a glance with Sebastian. The appointment had been confirmed weeks earlier through the normal maintenance calendar. Everything about it appeared legitimate. Still, neither of them ignored the timing. Rather than cancel the visit, Sebastian quietly approved it exactly as planned. "If someone expects us to panic," he said after the manager left, "I would rather disappoint them." Claire agreed. Routine reveals more than confrontation. Less than an hour later, she walked beside Emily through the estate gardens while two security officers remained comfortably out of sight. Fallen leaves drifted across stone pathways, and the lake reflected brilliant shades of gold beneath the clear October sky. Emily carried a small basket for collecting pine cones while Claire deliberately followed the route visible from several security cameras. If someone truly watched the estate, they would see nothing unusual. They would see an ordinary morning. Unfortunately for the observer, Claire had begun watching back. As they approached the shoreline gazebo, Emily suddenly stopped walking. She looked toward a maintenance truck parked near the irrigation pumps and quietly slipped her hand into Claire's. The logo on the truck matched the same unfamiliar company Claire had noticed days earlier across the lake. Two workers examined a control panel beside the water while speaking softly with another employee wearing an estate maintenance badge. Everything appeared professional. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Claire smiled warmly at Emily and knelt to admire a pine cone the little girl pretended to examine. While doing so, she casually looked beneath the parked truck. Fresh tire tracks covered with damp leaves suggested the vehicle had recently traveled somewhere beyond the marked service road. The workers would have had no reason to leave the designated path. Claire gently squeezed Emily's hand. "Would you like to feed the ducks instead?" Emily nodded, allowing Claire to guide her naturally toward the opposite side of the shoreline. From that new angle, Claire noticed something the workers could not see. One small security camera mounted beneath the gazebo roof had been subtly turned several degrees away from the service road, just enough to create a narrow blind spot. No storm could have shifted it that precisely. No bird could have moved it that carefully. Claire said nothing until they returned to the main house. Inside Sebastian's study, she quietly placed a sketch of the shoreline across his desk. She marked the truck location, the altered camera angle, and the unusual tire tracks with a blue pencil. Sebastian studied the page without interrupting. Finally, he looked up. "You believe they wanted us to notice the truck?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No, I believe they wanted us to keep looking at the truck while something else happened outside the camera's view." Before Sebastian could answer, a discreet notification appeared on the isolated backup monitoring screen installed beside his desk. One of the hidden cameras overlooking the eastern woods had finally captured someone entering the estate through the very blind spot that had never appeared in the official security recordings. The smallest decision a parent made often revealed who they truly were when everything else began to fall apart. Sebastian stared silently at the backup monitor while the hidden camera replayed the same 30 seconds again and again. A single person wearing ordinary outdoor clothing crossed through the narrow blind spot beside the eastern shoreline before disappearing into the trees. The face remained hidden beneath a baseball cap, but one detail immediately caught Claire's attention. The visitor carried no tools, no maintenance equipment, no reason to be anywhere near the service road. Sebastian paused the recording. How long until the official cameras noticed this person? Claire looked at the map displayed beside the video feed. They never will. That blind spot was designed to erase this entire path. The room fell silent. Outside the study windows, Emily laughed softly as she folded another blue paper bird beneath the old maple tree. The simple sound felt strangely precious against the growing weight inside the house. Sebastian pressed the intercom, quietly move everyone inside, except the normal exterior staff. No alarms, no visible changes. His voice remained steady. If someone believes the routine continues, let them keep believing it. Claire watched him closely. Only days earlier, she had expected a man who solved every problem through control. Instead, she saw someone willing to choose patience over fear because his daughter deserved one more peaceful afternoon. Less than 15 minutes later, Emily wandered into the library carrying her basket of pine cones. She carefully placed one beside each blue paper bird resting on the windowsill before looking toward Claire with quiet expectation. "Would you like another story?" Claire asked. Emily smiled gently and nodded. As they settled into the reading corner, Sebastian quietly left the room without disturbing them. Claire noticed but continued reading, allowing the familiar rhythm of the book to fill the room with calm. Emily leaned comfortably against her shoulder before slowly drifting into a peaceful nap. Claire closed the book only after the child's breathing became slow and even. Looking up, she found Sebastian waiting silently in the hallway. He motioned toward the sunroom where afternoon light painted long reflections across the polished floor. "There is something you deserve to know," he said softly. Claire followed him without speaking. He opened a small wooden box resting inside a cabinet. Carefully arranged inside were newspaper clippings, legal correspondence, handwritten notes, and several photographs. Claire immediately recognized herself in one of them. She was leaving the County Child Advocacy Center, carrying a stack of children's drawings beneath her arm. The photograph had clearly been taken from across the street almost a year earlier. Claire looked at Sebastian without hiding her surprise. "You had someone watching me." He met her eyes without looking away. "Yes." The answer came without excuses. "Not because I believed you were dangerous. Because Emily asked about you every week." Claire slowly returned her attention to the photographs. There were only a handful. None showed her inside her home. None invaded private moments. They simply documented places she visited openly: grocery stores, the library, volunteer events, ordinary pieces of an ordinary life. "I searched for every specialist in the country," Sebastian continued quietly. "Doctors, therapists, child psychologists. Emily refused all of them." He paused before lifting one folded drawing from the wooden box. It showed the familiar blue bird sitting beside a woman wearing a blue jacket. Across the top, written in careful block letters, Emily had printed 7 simple words. "Find the lady who stayed with me." Claire felt tears gather before she realized they had formed. She remembered. Sebastian nodded. She could not explain why. She only repeated, "Your blue jacket, your crayons, and the stories you read to her." Claire carefully returned the drawing to the box. "You could have sent someone to explain all of this months ago." A faint shadow crossed Sebastian's face. "I almost did." He looked toward the library where Emily continued sleeping peacefully beneath the blanket Claire had wrapped around her. "Then someone erased your name from every official record. I realized the person hiding you from Emily might also be watching anyone who searched for you." Claire slowly understood the terrible simplicity of his decision. Keeping his distance had not been indifference, it had been protection. "So you waited." Sebastian nodded once. "Until I believed bringing you here was less dangerous than leaving you alone." Before Claire could answer, a soft notification sounded from the backup security monitor carried by one of the guards entering the hallway. The officer stopped several feet away. "Sir," he said quietly, "the unidentified visitor has appeared again." Sebastian accepted the tablet without speaking. The hidden camera now showed the stranger standing near the old boathouse at the edge of the lake. This time, the person was not alone. Daniel Mercer, the electrical contractor whose name had appeared throughout the altered maintenance records, had just walked into the frame and handed the visitor a thick envelope before both men disappeared beneath the trees. The moment a hidden pattern finally revealed itself, every unexplained detail from the past suddenly found its place. Claire stood beside Sebastian in the quiet security room while the backup footage continued looping across 3 monitors. Daniel Mercer accepted the thick envelope without looking around, tucked it beneath his jacket, and disappeared into the trees beside the unidentified visitor. Neither man appeared hurried, neither acted like someone expecting to be discovered. That confidence disturbed Claire more than anything else. It suggested they believed the official security system remained under their control. Sebastian slowly folded his arms. "Do not intercept them," he told the head of security. The order surprised everyone in the room except Claire. "Let them leave exactly the way they planned." The security chief hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Understood." When the room emptied again, Claire looked towards Sebastian. "You are letting them walk away." He quietly shook his head. "I am letting them believe they already have." Claire understood immediately. If Mercer realized he had been exposed, every remaining answer would disappear with him. If he believed everything remained normal, he would eventually lead them to whoever had been directing him from the beginning. Outside, late afternoon sunlight stretched across the lake while Emily sat beneath the maple tree, arranging her blue paper birds into another careful pattern. Claire walked outside to join her, needing a moment away from computer screens and security reports. The little girl smiled softly as Claire settled onto the blanket beside her. Without speaking, Emily moved one blue bird from the center of the line to the very end. Then she pointed toward the open space it had left behind. Claire studied the arrangement for several quiet seconds before smiling. Someone left, but the place they occupied still matters. Emily nodded once. It was another quiet lesson wrapped inside a child's simple gesture. Claire realized that Emily had been trying to explain the same truth all along. Missing things often revealed more than the things that remained. As evening approached, Sebastian invited Claire into the music room overlooking the western gardens. A fire burned quietly inside the stone fireplace while soft piano melodies drifted from hidden speakers. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Claire noticed no security personnel standing outside the door. The silence felt intentional. "There is one last question you have never asked me," Sebastian said. Claire looked toward him. "Why did you believe Emily instead of everyone else?" He smiled faintly before walking toward an old upright piano resting beside the windows. A framed photograph stood on top. It showed Emily several years younger, sitting beside an elderly woman whose warm smile immediately drew Claire's attention. "My mother," Sebastian explained. "She raised me after my father died." Claire picked up the photograph carefully. "Emily resembles her." "She does." He looked toward the fire. "My mother spent 40 years teaching first grade. She used to tell me that children almost never forget the people who make them feel safe. They only lose the words to explain why." His voice remained calm, but something deeper rested beneath it. When Emily described a woman with blue crayons who stayed on the floor beside her instead of sitting across a desk, "My mother told me not to search for another specialist. She told me to find the same person." Claire lowered the photograph gently back into place. Everything suddenly felt much simpler than she had imagined. It had never been a search driven by power. It had been a father following the quiet wisdom of another parent who understood children better than any official report. At that exact moment, the head of security entered carrying a sealed evidence envelope. "Sir," he said, placing it carefully on the table. "The surveillance team recovered this after Mercer left the woods. Inside rested several copied property maps, outdated security schedules, and a handwritten payment ledger." Claire immediately noticed one final document tucked beneath the others. It was a duplicate of Emily's child advocacy intake form. Her own name had been removed from every visible section just as before, but this copy contained something the edited records had hidden. On the final page, beneath a faded approval stamp, another signature remained untouched because it had been written in blue crayon instead of ink. "Claire Dawson, requested by child." The room fell completely silent. Sebastian closed his eyes for only a moment before looking toward Claire. "She chose you long before I ever did." Claire stared at the page while every unanswered question finally settled into place. Emily had never been waiting for rescue. She had been waiting for someone to remember the promise hidden inside a room full of crayons, stories, and quiet patience. Outside the window, Emily looked up from her paper birds and smiled toward the house as though somehow she already knew the truth had finally found its way home. Healing rarely arrived the moment the truth was uncovered. It began when people finally stopped carrying it alone. The following morning unfolded beneath a clear October sky that painted the Romano estate in warm shades of gold and amber. For the first time since Claire had crossed the front gate, the air felt lighter. The hidden surveillance system remained active. Daniel Mercer's access had been permanently revoked, and every compromised maintenance contract had quietly been replaced. No dramatic announcements were made, No celebrations interrupted the peaceful rhythm of the house. Safety returned the same way trust had begun to grow, one quiet decision at a time. Claire stepped onto the back terrace carrying 2 mugs of tea. Sebastian was already there, standing beside the stone railing overlooking the lake where gentle ripples reflected the bright morning sun. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt earned. Claire handed him one of the mugs before resting her arms against the railing. "The estate sounds different today," she said softly. Sebastian listened for a moment. Wind moved through the trees. Ducks drifted across the water. Somewhere inside the house, Emily laughed at something one of the housekeepers had said. "It does," he admitted. "I had forgotten what ordinary sounded like." Claire smiled faintly. "Most people do after living with fear for too long." Sebastian remained quiet before looking toward her with "I owe you an apology." Claire met his eyes without speaking. "The first night I arrived at your house, I asked for your help without giving you the truth you deserved. I believed protecting you meant telling you less." He lowered his gaze toward the lake. "I was wrong." Claire considered his words carefully before answering. "You were trying to protect your daughter. Parents do not always choose perfectly. They choose with the information they have." Sebastian let out a slow breath. "That does not excuse it." "No," Claire agreed gently, "but it explains it." The conversation ended there because neither of them needed to win the moment. Understanding had quietly replaced suspicion. Inside the house, Emily waited in the art room with colored pencils scattered across a wide wooden table. Sunlight poured through skylights above, illuminating every sheet of paper like small windows waiting for stories. Claire joined her without saying a word. Emily immediately pushed a blank page toward her along with the familiar blue crayon. Claire laughed softly. "You want us to draw together again?" Emily nodded. They spent the next half hour drawing trees, birds, clouds, and crooked little houses exactly as they had once done inside the Child Advocacy Center. This time there were no interviews waiting afterward, no official reports, no frightened silence filling the room. Just a little girl rediscovering a place where she could breathe. When Claire finished her drawing, Emily carefully added one final detail. She drew 3 figures standing beneath the familiar trees. The blue bird rested on a nearby branch instead of flying overhead. There were no grey figures, no empty spaces. Emily placed the blue crayon down and looked at Claire before speaking in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "You came back." The words were simple, quiet, fragile. Yet they carried more strength than any speech Claire had ever heard. She gently reached across the table and held Emily's small hand. "I told you I would stay as long as you needed me." Emily smiled, and this time the smile reached her eyes. Standing quietly in the hallway, Sebastian heard every word without entering the room. He remained where he was, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. For perhaps the first time in years, he understood that protecting the people he loved did not always require stepping between them and danger. Sometimes it meant stepping aside so healing could find its own way. Later that afternoon, the estate attorney arrived with several recovered documents from the county archive. The final review confirmed what Claire and Sebastian already knew. Emily's records had been intentionally altered. Unauthorized access had been traced back through Daniel Mercer, and the remaining administrative corrections would permanently restore the missing files exactly as they had originally existed. No new mysteries remained. No unanswered questions lingered in forgotten folders. The truth had finally returned to where it belonged. As evening settled across the lake, Claire stood once more beneath the old maple tree watching Emily release a blue paper bird into the gentle breeze. It floated only a few feet before landing softly among fallen leaves, but Emily laughed anyway. She no longer cared how far it traveled. She only cared that it had been free to fly. Claire looked towards Sebastian, who watched his daughter with quiet gratitude instead of constant worry. Without speaking, he gave Claire a small nod that carried every thank you words could never fully express. For the first time since the rainy night that had brought them together, Claire realized she no longer felt like a visitor standing inside someone else's life. She had become part of the place where a frightened little girl had always believed she would eventually be found. Every story that truly changed a life ended the same way. Not with applause, not with revenge, but with the quiet realization that home had finally become a place instead of a memory. 6 months later, the first warm days of spring had transformed the Romano estate into something almost unrecognizable. The bare branches that had once rattled beneath cold autumn rain now carried fresh green leaves that shimmered beneath gentle morning sunlight. The lake reflected a bright blue sky without a single ripple disturbing its surface. Birds nested among the old maple trees, and flower beds surrounding the stone pathways had begun to bloom with soft colors that made the entire property feel lighter than it ever had before. Claire stepped onto the back porch carrying a basket filled with art supplies, while the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted through the open kitchen windows. The silence that greeted her was no longer the heavy silence of fear. It was the peaceful silence of people who no longer needed to look over their shoulders every few minutes. Emily raced across the lawn wearing faded sneakers and a denim jacket with blue ribbons tied into her hair. She laughed as she chased a paper bird lifted by the spring breeze, her voice echoing across the gardens with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. She no longer carried her stuffed rabbit everywhere she went. It still rested safely on the bookshelf inside her bedroom, but it had become a keepsake instead of a shield. Claire watched her for a moment before spreading drawing paper across the picnic table beneath the maple tree. Emily hurried over, carrying a small box of carefully organized crayons. Without needing to ask, she placed the blue crayon beside Claire first. Some traditions deserved to remain exactly as they were. A few moments later, Sebastian walked out from the house dressed simply in rolled sleeves and dark jeans instead of tailored suits. He carried a tray with lemonade, fresh fruit and warm blueberry muffins that one of the housekeepers had baked earlier that morning. He set everything on the table before looking toward the two people who had quietly become the center of his world. There was no guarded distance left in his expression, no constant calculation hidden behind careful eyes. He still carried responsibility with quiet strength, but responsibility no longer looked like isolation. Claire smiled as Emily immediately insisted that Sebastian sit beside them instead of across the table. He obeyed without pretending to resist. Together they spent the morning drawing impossible trees with oversized branches. Birds colored every shade except the ones found in nature, and little lakes filled with smiling fish that ignored every law of biology. Their laughter rose and disappeared into the warm breeze, while the old estate quietly accepted a future built from ordinary moments instead of constant vigilance. Later that afternoon, a delivery truck arrived carrying several framed certificates from the County Child Advocacy Office. Emily's original case file had been fully restored. Claire's name appeared exactly where it had always belonged, accompanied by every note, observation, and recommendation that had once been erased. The agency had also invited Claire to return as a consultant whenever she wished. She thanked them with genuine gratitude but declined the full-time position. Her calling had never changed, only its address had. Before sunset, Claire walked alone to the edge of the lake where the water reflected streaks of orange and gold beneath the fading sky. Sebastian quietly joined her without interrupting the peaceful silence. They watched a family of ducks glide across the water before he finally spoke. "I spent years believing I could protect the people I loved by building stronger walls." Claire looked toward the lake. "And now?" He smiled gently. "Now I know people feel safest when they know someone will stay beside them after the walls are no longer necessary." Claire turned toward him. There were no dramatic declarations waiting between them, no promises spoken simply because stories expected them. Instead, Sebastian carefully reached for her hand. She accepted it with quiet certainty. Nothing about the gesture felt hurried. It felt like the natural ending to every choice they had already made. Behind them, Emily called their names from the garden. She stood beneath the maple tree, holding one final drawing high above her head so they could both see it. Claire and Sebastian walked back together while the evening light settled softly across the grass. Emily proudly placed the picture on the picnic table. Three people stood beneath two tall trees beside a quiet lake. A bright blue bird rested peacefully on one branch. Above them, the sun filled the page with warm yellow light. There were no grey figures, no missing spaces, no erased names. Claire looked at the drawing before meeting Emily's smiling eyes. "It is beautiful," she whispered. Emily nodded proudly before taking one hand from Claire and one from Sebastian. Together they walked slowly through the gardens while the last light of day shimmered across the water, exactly where months earlier cold rain had reflected fear and uncertainty. The camera of memory seemed to drift higher and higher above the estate until the three small figures became part of the landscape itself, walking toward a future that no longer needed to be imagined because they had already built it together. Sometimes the greatest act of protection is not rescuing someone from the darkness. It is staying long enough to help them believe in the morning again.